remains from what happened in 2018. And she said tremendous amount because we were successful and we saw that what we did made a difference. And she thought that that would continue to propel her forward. You know, the issue of healthcare, I mean, this will be the, what, 2010, 12, 14, 16, 18, 20 consecutive elections in which the Affordable Care Act is going to be in one form or another front and center in the debate. And so for a lot of Democrats, they feel that that will be a winning issue now in ways that it wasn't a winning issue when President Obama was still in office. So I think the balance is that the Democrats will want to say that they're only talking about some of these issues, but the reality is that President Trump still remains the biggest issue in the minds of many voters.
Jennifer, what do you make of that sense of voter enthusiasm in 2018 and how it might influence the 2020 race?
So I'm very worried. I mean, I was saying earlier, it's been a bad 48 hours for me. I am not really that objective right now. I just feel like things are crummy. I think there are a couple of different dynamics at play. The first is that voters were very enthusiastic in 2018, largely because of what happened in 2016. A lot of that was because Trump as president turned out to be a lot like Trump on the campaign trail. And part of it was also that there was this general sense that they expected Hillary Clinton to win the election, and she didn't, and 2018 was the first opportunity to set that right. But the backdrop to 2018 did entail some of these investigations and the general sense that Mueller's investigation is underway, there are these indictments, there's a lot going on, something is going to come of this. And now it seems like maybe nothing came of that. Regardless of what the contents of the report really are, or regardless of what Barr even said, the way that it's being spun by the White House obviously is a complete exoneration. And so, you know, I think it's tricky. We don't know, with that piece of the backdrop gone, how energized people will be about Trump as Trump. I do think that in 2018, the good news for the Democrats was that they mobilized and energized a lot of new voters, and one of the best predictors of whether you're going to vote next time is whether you voted last time. And the Democrats were able to really build a base of people who are ready to get engaged and who have been engaged even since the 2018 midterms. So, you know, I think it's an open question, but if the election were held today, I wouldn't bet on the Democrats.
Chris,
sorry.
You were part of the administration that gave us the ACA, and you've seen it both work for Republicans and work for Democrats in a lot of ways. What do you make of its role in the upcoming 2020 election?
So I will agree with Jen. We're not, I will say we're friends. We're not friends, but we will become friends. The election's held today, Donald Trump loses. But you know, a lot can happen in the next however long we have. I don't think it's an either or between policy, bread and butter policy issues and investigating. I mean, what's interesting about where the Democratic Party is, you've got this very powerful grassroots base who are ginned up over things like Russia, impeachment, corruption. They're the people that fuel the small dollar donations. They're the people that are on the boots on the ground to volunteer. And then you have a lot of other voters who aren't as tuned in. And so you saw how Democratic candidates kind of played both sides of that. I mean, you see that here in Virginia. I happen to know Abigail Spanberger, I know Elaine Luria. They weren't running on impeachment, but they benefit from the energy that comes out of the base that allows them to pick off marginal districts. And I think it's that two-pronged strategy that Democrats will keep. You'll have people in the House investigating, and you'll have people on the campaign trail, both 2020, congressional candidates and presidential, talking about something else. And I think that lives side by side. I think in many ways the best gift that, and this will sound like spin, the best gift that the Trump administration could have done was to take this move on the ACA, because you're now playing right back into the Democrats' wheelhouse. Healthcare is what got them the House majority, and if you want to ensure they keep the majority and take the White House, talk about healthcare again. I think what's interesting, and Dan, you may know the statistics better, Trump won independent voters in 2012, I think, by 4% or something. In 2018, Democrats won it by +8, +6, or plus. It was a substantial flip. And when you look at issues like health care, especially pre-existing conditions, that goes right back into Democrats' sweet spot. So, and let me also say this. I mean, what are we, like 4 weeks removed from the government shutdown? We've not talked about that anymore. Like, the news cycle goes so fast. In a week, we'll be talking about something else. And that's so it's hard to make predictions about what November 2020 looks like.
But I think that's a very, very important point, Chris. And that is, we have no idea kind of what will be top of mind in October 2020. We have no idea about what will have transpired between now and then. But I think 2020 is so important in the minds of a lot of people because we are at a moment in our political history that is different than that we've gone through in the past. And this election will be very much about this issue or that issue or the other issue. But fundamentally, it's about where are we as a country, and is this the kind of country we want? And I think that when people think about it in those terms, some of these other issues or some of these other controversies that will flare and fade will not be as significant as that kind of front and center issue.
I'll add one thing. The one thing you know that will not be the same as now is the economy will not be what it is now. And what you've continued to see is the president's approval ratings significantly lagging where the economy is right now. And by all accounts, again, nobody could predict where the economy is. We will not be at 3.9% unemployment. We will not be creating 200,000 jobs a month. There's definitely something happening. Now, again, we've seen a disconnect between the economy and politics over the last 2 years. So even if the economy worsens, that may not have any impact on approval ratings either.
Well, you mentioned that the direction of the country is going to be one of the big focal questions for 2020. Is that question a boon for Democrats, or does it work against them?
Well, it works on both sides. I mean, I was in Europe the latter part of January talking to people in Britain and France and Germany about, we were talking about the transatlantic relationship, but we were really talking about Donald Trump. And the issue that kept coming up was, what's the difference between one more two-year period of Trump, in other words, one term, versus 2 terms? And depending on where you were, but in almost all cases, it was, all right, 4 years of Donald Trump will bring some change to the world and to the United States. 8 years could bring significant change. And so the question is, what happens if there's 4 or 8 years? I think people on both sides of that question feel very passionately about that. People who support President Trump believe deeply that he is taking the country in the right direction, that he is, in a sense, blowing up things that need to be blown up, and that if that's cut off after 4 years, then something, then they revert to a country that they're not happy with. The people who are against Donald Trump feel just as passionately. So my sense is that that's going to drive turnout on both sides.
I think that's right. I also think it's important to keep in mind that there are 2 dimensions. So political scientists have known for a long time that a lot of people vote retrospectively. So they look at where they are today and they say, am I better off now than I was 4 years ago? And a lot of the time that was based on economic issues. Starting in about 2000, there was an extra dimension added to that, and that's called moral retrospective voting. So people look at the way the country is perceived internationally. They look at what our leaders stand for. In 2000, for example, it wound up hurting Al Gore that Bill Clinton was seen as not having the values and the morals that we wanted in a president. Because when voters looked back, they were like, you know what, things were better in 1992 before this guy came to the White House and before sort of all hell broke loose with scandals and everything else. So I think that there are these cross-cutting dimensions there as well. The people that are in support of Donald Trump's policies until this point have generally been willing to say, you know what, I'm willing to let go of some of his moral indiscretions or some of his temperament problems. I don't know if that's going to last another 2 years. We'll see.
So we have a pretty big crowd of Democrats getting ready to run in 2020. I think if we ran through all of the names, we'd probably kill off the rest of our time.
Probably some people in this room.
Look, there's a lot of them. I'm not going to discount it. To what extent does that help or hurt the Democrats? Is it good that it's such a big field? Is it a problem because you could end up having someone who gets 20% enthusiastic support who ends up becoming the nominee when they might have a lower ceiling than other candidates? How do you feel about the breadth of the Democratic field?
So I'll start. I mean, this is the exact same thing people said about the Republican field in 2015, 2016. There were too many candidates. I think, look, I mean, there are a lot of people. I don't think you will, by the time you get to Iowa in, 9 months, there won't be this many candidates, because as much money as there is on the Democratic side, it's not enough to sustain all of these candidates. And yeah, they'll make it for that first debate in June, but after that, if you're still polling 1 or 2%, it's expensive to run campaigns. You know, some of these people are single issue, some of these candidates are single issue candidates, some are frankly probably trying to sell some books. It's just not enough to sustain a campaign. So a bunch of these folks will drop out. And I think when you look at the Democratic calendar, it's not only what happens in Iowa and those first 4 early states. If you start looking at the calendar of it's like 5 Super Tuesdays in a row, you're going to quickly realize if you can't come out of one of those first 4 early states, having won or done very well in a couple of those states, there is no path forward. So I think it'll eventually come down to 2 or 3 main candidates. I think the interesting challenge is not how many we have, but how it fundamentally ends. And the reason I say this is that there's so much small dollar money. Like, I'll say this and I'll say it. Bernie Sanders is not the nominee, but Bernie Sanders will not, he's not going to leave the race, because he has the base of support, he has the fundraising that'll take him all the way till the very end. Beto O'Rourke probably has that base. So you have candidates who just have that fundraising capacity that will drag out the race longer than in a typical nominating campaign. And I will say this, I'm also a DNC superdelegate, and so we have the ability when we get to a brokered convention to actually help make this decision.
Do you expect a brokered convention?
Well, I mean, Dan, when was the last one? The 52, 48, something like that.
Yeah.
It's been a long time.
I've been at the Post 40 years. We've been waiting every cycle for the brokered convention,
piece
and it never comes to pass. So I've given up hope.
Yeah.
So you do have this broad range of candidates, but how broad is the range of policy difference? Like, are they, I mean, what are voters going to decide on? Do these candidates disagree with one another? What's the space between the different candidates?
They want to decide who has the best shot at beating Donald Trump. And right now, if they were told that a cantaloupe sitting on the stage had the best shot, they would vote for that cantaloupe. And so, I mean, if you look at all of the polls, everything right now is about viability and name recognition. So the candidates that are polling the best are Biden, who hasn't entered the race, Sanders, and O'Rourke. It's not a coincidence that Sanders made it very far in 2016 and that O'Rourke stunned the nation just a couple of months ago. Generally speaking, whether there are significant policy differences among these candidates is incidental to the case that they're able to make to Democrats and to independents that they can win this election, because their overall visions for moving the country forward aren't that different from one another. The language that they use is different, and I think Bernie Sanders is probably a little bit different than the rest, but an Amy Klobuchar presidency, a Joe Biden presidency, a Kamala Harris presidency, a Cory Booker presidency, I don't think are going to look fundamentally different. What's the biggest difference is going to be how those presidencies would compare to a Donald Trump presidency. It's not to say that there aren't some policy differences, but at the end of the day, those policy differences are probably not what's going to matter, at least in terms of the general election.
I think I agree with that. There are policy differences. I mean, today, for example, John Hickenlooper came out against the Green New Deal resolution, putting down a marker that he's going to be a centrist, moderate candidate. Not surprisingly, that was his profile when he was governor of Colorado. There will be a policy debate, which is probably useful for the party. Sanders is at the far left, and Hickenlooper may be much closer to the center, and it's important to have that debate. When you've been out of the White House 4 years, you need to go through the process of saying what we stand for. I don't know if you all would agree, but I expect that this will be the most liberal Democratic platform we've ever seen in history, and yet in some ways it won't necessarily seem that liberal because some of those issues have moved. Some of the public in general has moved. But I think as vigorous a debate as the Democrats can have, and with as many candidates who can stay in a viable way for as long as possible, is going to be healthy. I mean, a good, vigorous campaign, unless it becomes destructive, produces a stronger nominee than a campaign in which you don't have that kind of competition.
Although it's also important to keep in mind that those debates and those sound bites and the discussions coming out of those debates can ultimately be used against the nominee. And I think the Democrats are already seeing some of this when you know, if you turn on Fox News, if you look at Republican talking points, they're saying things like the Democrats want to tax the rich at 70%, right? They've caricatured the positions of a very, very small number of members and said that this embodies what's going on. So I wouldn't be surprised if even during these vigorous policy debates, the Democratic candidates are quite careful about how they're portraying their positions, because at the end of the day, it's in all of their interest to make sure that one of them is elected and not Donald Trump.
I mean, I think, look, we're going to be in silly season for the next year, and we're going to be arguing about relatively insignificant things. I mean, whether you call it Medicare for All, or you call it Green New Deal, every Democrat believes we need to expand health care. Every Democrat thinks we need to fight climate change. They'll package it in different ways, and they'll be on different ends of the spectrum, and you'll have seemingly insignificant things in debates get magnified. I mean, I remember back in 2008, a crazy from left field question was asked at a Democratic debate. Do you think undocumented immigrants should get driver's licenses? And I think Hillary Clinton was the only one who said no. I think I might make that. But like, that became a campaign issue, and that was never an issue for anybody. And so, you know, I think we're going to be in this time when people are going to be looking for stylistic differences. Every single thing they say in a diner in Iowa is going to be recorded, and that will be a focus of conversation. But I mean, I think when you go back to it, I mean, look, again, going back to 2016, you'd have to say the rules have all been upended. I mean, there's no one who had more controversial statements than Donald Trump, and no more statements that you could throw back in a general election, and it really didn't matter. So I'm not saying the rules of politics have changed, but I think you can go, it's always the case in primaries, you go to one extreme and then you pivot right back to the middle again, and that's what I think Democrats will end up doing.
Although I don't think you could say that Donald Trump made any pivot at any point in that campaign.
And I think
which is to your point, that
right.
the rules have been broken.
Yeah.
And we'll see in what ways Democrats adapt to that new world facing against Donald Trump.
So what do you make of Dan's assertion that this is going to be the most liberal Democratic platform in recent memory? I mean, what does it say about the Democratic Party that the things that are being debated in this cycle are the Green New Deal, are Medicare for All instead of something like the Affordable Care Act? Where are Democrats headed, and how far in that direction do you think that they're going to go in the next 10 or 20 years?
I mean, it's sort of funny. So I'm a fellow here at the Miller Center. We obviously do the oral history project for the presidents. I did part of mine today, and I was recounting some of the policy stances we took in the Obama administration in 2009, 2010, which would seem fairly conservative by today's Democratic Party standards. I mean, we had a long-running debate in like 2012 as to whether we could agree to a 10-10 minimum wage. We're now at $15 an hour, and $15 an hour is a fairly it's not that mainstream, but it's a fairly accepted position within the Democratic Party. And when you ask people more broadly, do you think we should raise the minimum wage, they all agree with it. So I think the party has moved, but I think the American people have moved as well. And so I think once you take the labels off of Medicare for All, Green New Deal, and you say, should we expand health care and make it more affordable? Everyone say basically yes. Should we do more to fight climate change? Should we do more on gun control? These are fairly mainstream positions. The packaging is the problematic parts of some of this now. Well,
and the cost issue. I mean, when you get down below, all right, Green New Deal or Medicare for All, however you define it, are aspirational in a sense. Yeah. And for a Democratic candidate, that might be quite good. The question is, okay, how do you actually do that? Who's prepared to actually have a program? What does it actually cost? What are the details of it? The degree to which that gets aired out will affect some candidacies.
Except I'll say this, and I mean, you know, what Donald Trump decried the national debt when he was running, it was $17 trillion when he came in. It's $21 trillion now. I don't think people, the deficit's this amorphous concept that I don't think people are just happy to spend money now. I don't think it really registers to the public, unfortunately, because I think it should matter.
Chris, you listed off a number of policies that are really popular, including gun control, work towards climate change activism. The Democratic platform is, by and large, including raises to minimum wage, polls really, really well. A lot of Republican policies are pretty unpopular. So why haven't Democrats been able to translate their very popular policies into majorities or wins in presidential elections? What's the thing that's stopping their popular platform from helping them win more elections?
I mean, the reality is they've won the popular vote in 6 of the last 7 elections and won the presidency in 4 of those. So part of it is the vagaries of the Electoral College and the inability in a couple of cases to maximize an Electoral College strategy as opposed to a popular vote strategy. So you're right, although individual policies, I mean, the public is in general supportive of things, as you suggest, that spend money and always have been, and at the same time they decry the national debt or money in politics or things. There's, people have their own contradictions about things. But ultimately it comes down to the candidate. It's not just the platform. I mean, as Bob Dole, I think, famously said after the 1996 platform, nobody's ever going to read the thing, so why should he worry about what's in it? I mean, that may be a paraphrase, but something like that. So, I mean, the real issue is people in a presidential campaign are judging, are making judgments about two individuals. And in 2016, we had the two most unpopular nominees that we've ever had in a modern presidential election, and it turned out that the one who was more unpopular ended up getting elected because they were able to thread the Electoral College needle.
Beyond that, something else I would note is people are experts at motivated reasoning. And so people believe that the candidates they support and the parties they support share their views and values when they're not sure what the party actually stands for or supports. And when they find out that the party supports something else, they change. People's attitudes toward Vladimir Putin are a perfect example of this. So in July of 2016, 15% of Republicans and 16% of Democrats had a favorable view of Putin, right? So 85% of Democrats and Republicans had very unfavorable views. The summer goes on, Donald Trump says things that are somewhat flattering. By October and November, when Donald Trump won, Democratic support for Putin had stayed steady and Republican support had tripled. And that's where it has remained. And so it's important to realize that although people, when they're answering public opinion polls, have attitudes about particular policies and questions, they're malleable and they're also more likely to get in line behind the person who shares their party label. The two candidates were the least liked that we'd seen in presidential history, but 89% of their co-partisans still supported them, which was not very different than any of the presidential elections dating back to 1956.
So what about strategy when it comes to 2020 for Democrats? Clearly the candidate who's ultimately selected is going to matter, but one of the things that has been haunting Democrats since 2016 are those 70,000 voters in Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin who tilted the election toward Donald Trump, and that has led to some soul searching about should we be focusing more on blue-collar white workers or should we be focusing more on bringing out women and minority voters. Are those two mutually exclusive strategies for the Democrats? Do they have to choose one or the other, especially in an era of fairly racialized politics?
I don't think it's an either-or concept. I mean, I go back to the 2008 Obama coalition. I mean, people forget, he won Indiana, he won North Carolina, he won Florida, he won Ohio. So it's not like you have to choose one or the other, but you have to speak to these people. You certainly have to campaign in those states, and obviously that was an issue that Hillary Clinton can rightly be faulted on for not going to those places. But I think if you come up with good, sensible policies that appeal to the broad swath of people, you can have it both ways. It's not, for every time we talk about white working class workers, there are African American working class people as well who share those same concerns.
Go ahead.
No, I do think that a lot of this does come down to the question of who can inspire the kind of turnout that you're going to have. I mean, one thing we know about President Trump is he can turn out voters. And he turns them out in areas where we have paid far less attention, smaller, more rural, small-town counties. And he's able to expand the normal margins of a Republican candidate in places like that. Democrats have to figure out a way to inspire people, as they were able to do in 2018, to come out in areas where they are able to maximize. And Chris, I think I don't disagree with you that it doesn't have to be an either-or, but you do have to have a candidate in 2020 who can inspire the new Democratic Party. And that new Democratic Party is much more people of color, more African Americans, to some extent Latinos, more women, particularly college-educated women, more younger voters. You have to have people who can do that. There were places that Hillary Clinton was unable to do that, certainly in Michigan and Wisconsin. What was interesting in 2018 was to look at what happened in Florida and Georgia with Stacey Abrams and Andrew Gillum, both of whom ran very progressive campaigns for the most part, to African American candidates who came closer than Democrats have come in Florida, closer than anybody's come in 20 years as a Democratic gubernatorial nominee. And
white Democrats. They did better than white Democrats.
White Democrats. Yeah. And I asked Mayor Gillum recently, would a white candidate have done better in Florida than you? I mean, given everything we know, or someone who was sort of less progressive in the way they push the issues. And he said, I don't think so. He said, in fact, if you look at what turnout normally would have been, just based on year by year or election by election increases in turnout in Florida, he said you would have projected that turnout in the gubernatorial race would have been about 6.1 million people. He said, in fact, it was 8 million people. And he said, I don't think a white candidate would have produced that kind of turnout. On the other hand, he said, the other side produced big turnout also, in part because the campaign got racialized in Florida in the gubernatorial race. So he said it's a bit of a mixed bag, but he thought if a Democratic candidate had been white and more moderate, Gwen Graham, who a lot of people had thought would be the Democratic nominee starting that race, he thought that she would have lost by a little bit more than he did. So the question is, how do you find that candidate who can both generate the kind of support you have to have in the new Democratic Party and still reach back and get some of the voters that the Democrats lost in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania?
Although something to think about is we talk about those 70,000 voters. If Democratic turnout would have been 1% higher in those 3 states, Hillary Clinton would be the president of the United States. So it's not necessarily that then Democrats have to have a message that can appeal to some of those plus everybody else. If they were to go down the path of, you know what, Trump can have them. I'm not suggesting that this is what they should do, but if they were to say, Trump can take those 70,000, we don't want them, there are still paths to the White House for a Democrat, because there were a lot of people who didn't turn out to vote at all.
It does seem like both parties at the moment, based on the 2016 race and the 2018 races, are very much in a base politics kind of mode, like trying to turn out people by amping up the base. Does a centrist Democratic candidate really have a shot in the 2020 primary? Or is the Democratic Party more focused on turning out the base? Can a centrist turn out the base for Democrats?
I was going to say, I wouldn't call Joe Biden a centrist,
yeah, I was going to say that.
Right? I mean, I think that I'm not sure I would agree with him that he has the most progressive record of anyone running, or, quote, anybody thinking of running, as he put it the other day. He's not a centrist, never has been. Is he more moderate than Bernie Sanders? Yes. So I guess you would say, could a John Hickenlooper do that? Probably not, which is why he's going to have a very challenged route to trying to win the nomination. But this will be the test for Vice President Biden. Can he generate the kind of enthusiasm that is going to be needed? And we'll begin to see that in about a month.
I'd say this. It's not only, look, even I'd say John Hickenlooper on the political spectrum is on the left. I mean, he's clearly on the left. Howard Schultz, the pre-Howard Schultz that whatever he is now, is clearly on the left. It's as much as it's tonally as well. The idea, and Hickenlooper has basically, and I love watching everyone's campaign rollout videos. You should do it. He talks about bringing Democrats and Republicans together in Colorado. Joe Biden talks about working with Republicans in the Senate. Tonally, that's, I think, different than where the base is. The base is in fighting mode right now. And so the question is not, I think policies, again, it's on spectrum, but it's relatively minor differences. It's can somebody who espouses bipartisanship, bringing the country together, is that a message that works in a primary? I don't know that.
I will say that if we look at congressional approval over time, it's hard to be any more disgusted with Congress and the job that they're doing, right? Head lice literally polls as more popular than the United States Congress. North Korea polls almost as popular.
This has actually been polled?
Yes, it's a true story. It's a true story.
Yeah, who's pro head lice? That's like
I mean, another great one was heading into the 2014 midterms where we thought we had reached the bottom and we hadn't. People were asked, would you favor replacing every single member of Congress with a random person walking down the street? And 49% of people said yes. Right? So Congress is not that beloved. So I think the needle that needs to be threaded is indicating that you have an ability to work with Congress to get something done so that we can end this dysfunction and these perceptions of gridlock, and actual gridlock, but also not sort of falling back on any of the principles that your party wants. And so somebody like Joe Biden is uniquely situated to say that because he can say, look, I believe in X, Y, and Z, and look at what I did. Even though Congress was a different entity and a different animal when he had served. And even though politics looked, it was a little bit easier to get things done. I mean, polarization has been on the rise over time, but things have gotten increasingly worse. So I think rhetorically and literally there are two very different things going on. And if people aren't paying really close attention, you can probably have it both ways.
So I'm curious if you can put your historian hats on for a second. It does seem what all of you are saying is that the Democratic Party has changed substantially since the 1990s when the Democratic Leadership Council was tacking much more toward a centrist position. I mean, centrist Democrats were more or less running the show then. What happened? What changed? Why has the Democratic Party moved into this more liberal direction?
I mean, I would argue the Republican Party has changed during that period of time, too. I mean, it's fair to say that, you know, fiscal conservatism, pro-free trade is no longer where this party, the Republican Party, largely is either. So I think it's, I mean, again, historically, it's the evolution of the parties. I mean, the Democratic Party of now is not the Democratic Party of the, you know, certainly not the 1970s, probably 1960s as well. So I think it's an evolution. But you would argue that the country has changed, too. I mean, you know, in 2004, George W. Bush ran an entire re-election campaign. The undercurrent was gay marriage. And now that's an relatively accepted, I mean, it's his accepted position, it's the law of the land. So the country's changed.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I think the country has changed a lot, and I agree with Chris that the Republican Party has probably changed more than the Democratic Party. I mean, the shift in the Democratic Party that Bill Clinton implemented was in essence a survival strategy, because they had lost 3 consecutive presidential elections by probably the biggest combined electoral margin of any in history. This was a party that after 1988 was on its back, and something had to be done to bring it back. And what Bill Clinton did in a very smart and shrewd political way as well as substantive way was figure out what are the policies that people like about the Democrats and what are the policies that they don't like, and how do you maximize what they like and minimize what they don't like. And out of that came the New Democrat philosophy. What's happened since then is that, as Chris says, the country has moved on a lot of these issues. People look at things differently. I mean, events change people's attitudes, presidencies change people's attitudes, presidential campaigns affect the way people think about things, and so we're simply in a different place. The question will be, is this, you know, is where the Democratic Party is, where the country as a whole wants to be in 2020, and you know that in every presidential campaign, it's this combination of kind of what is the real mood of the country, where is the country, what are people thinking about, what are their aspirations, and who's the candidate who figures that out better. And in 2016, it was clearly Donald Trump. I mean, Donald Trump put his finger on some things that were festering in the, you know, in the electorate, and he was able to take advantage of that. And Secretary Clinton was not. She was behind the curve in understanding how you deal with those things. Not necessarily that she would have agreed with Donald Trump, but how do you counter that? And she was not able to do that.
I'd add that part of the change is the result of elite polarization. So once Newt Gingrich became Speaker of the House and ushered in this Republican Congress that really, really prioritized party loyalty, and he made it clear that there were going to be sticks as well as carrots if you defied the leaders, the elites were able to take a series of positions, and those were then the choices that they presented to voters. And so the Republicans were able to coalesce behind a series of policies, as were the Democrats, and regardless of what the American people want, on election day, they're making choices between two things that they're given. So they can choose A or B, even if they really like something in the middle. And I think as the elites have become increasingly polarized, the choices presented to the voters became increasingly polarized, and then over time, that leads to issue evolution as well.
I'd also say it's also the changing demographics of the country as well. And you all may know the statistics better in terms of where Barack Obama did among white voters compared to the share that John Kerry got or Al Gore. It's significant. It's going lower and lower. And yet they've come up with a way to come up with a new governing coalition based on the diversification of the country. You also have shifting alliances within each party. You know, that white blue-collar voter was traditionally a union voter that was staunchly in the Democratic corner. As unions have gone down, those groups have moved over to the Republican side.
I mean, one of the biggest divides today, which we didn't really talk about 15 years ago, is the difference between college-educated voters and non-college-educated voters, particularly among whites. And that division has just grown dramatically under President Trump. And so white college-educated females are now a very important part of the Democratic base in the way they were not 10 or 15 years ago.
Another big change, Jen, I noticed one of the subtitles of your books was something to the effect of why women don't run.
Right.
We
still don't. I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but we did see a record number of women run in 2018, and I don't want to say that that wasn't monumental, but we also saw a record number of men run in 2018 on the Democratic side of the aisle because everybody was so energized. And in the primary anyway, the ratio of female candidates was still only about 25%. Now, they did a little bit better than they usually do in the primary, so by the time we got to the general election, they were about 40% of the Democratic candidates. But overall, we've got a situation where women are still far less likely than men to consider running for office. They're still far less likely to be recruited to run. They're still less likely to think they're qualified to run. And even when they do consider it, they're far less likely to do it. So we haven't closed this gender gap in political ambition. We have been able to identify several dozen women who are well situated to run for Congress, and that can significantly up women's representation. But I think it's important to draw a distinction between those two factors. You can still have a group of people that are very well situated to run who opt not to do so, but see progress. The other thing I would note is, for all of the gains that the Democrats have made, the Republicans have fallen farther and farther behind, and they actually have fewer women serving now than they have in the last several Congresses.
So what do you make of the many women running for the Democratic presidential primary? Are there particular challenges that they face or opportunities that they face? Because we have a record number of women vying for the presidential nomination.
We do, and I think the nice thing about it is some are very qualified and some are not, which suggests that we finally reached the point in time where women feel the same freedom as men to run for president. I mean, I think...
Do you want to list who's...
Yeah,
want to go through that list?
You know, we don't know systematically the way that the sex of a candidate matters at the presidential level. This election cycle will shed some light on that, but up until now, the only candidate that ever garnered the nomination was Hillary Clinton. And it's easy to say that she lost because of sexism, but you can also argue that she lost because of Clintonism. And the candidates running this time around don't have Clintonism. So we'll be able to assess a little bit better, I think, how women fare and how they're treated. The upside right now, assuming that the 2020 landscape looks similar to the way it did in 2018, is that women represent, on the Democratic side of the aisle, a very credible voice to take on a lot of the policies that Donald Trump embodies that aren't necessarily favorable toward women, families, and children. And those are economic issues, those are healthcare issues, those are education issues. I'm not thinking only about issues like pay equity or reproductive rights. So broadly construed, these women have the ability to call attention in a very credible way to some of the things that Trump did not. The other thing I would add is that I think Hillary Clinton was stuck between a rock and a hard place, because in the month leading up to the election, when the Access Hollywood tape came out, for example, she was limited in how she could respond to that because of her husband. if you think about, not to say that anything is equated, I'm just suggesting that it would cue, you know, indications of hypocrisy. And so
Trump brought Clinton's accusers
the women
to the debate.
Yeah, I mean, yes. So if you think about 2020, none of these candidates, I don't think, as who knows what's going to come out, but as of right now, none of these candidates is in a position where they wouldn't be able to call him out on a lot of this behavior. And so I think even on that dimension, they're coming in strong.
You know, one of the interesting dynamics you see play out here in Virginia, you had these two remarkable, well, you had 3 seats get picked up by women, but you had 2 in Abigail Spanberger and Elaine Luria, people who didn't come up through the traditional political structure, who had one, Elaine Luria as a naval officer, Abigail Spanberger as a CIA operative, who had traditional male jobs, but could talk about bread and butter family issues without seeming soft. And didn't come up through the traditional party structure, just ran and had these really incredible resumes. And one of the funny parts now, as you see, as you talk about Kamala Harris or Amy Klobuchar, the idea that they might be too tough on crime because they were former prosecutors. I mean, that's sort of an interesting role reversal for women that I actually think is a good debate to have. I mean, I think having a woman who's tough on crime is a nice traditional gender reversal.
But that's also a reflection of kind of where the base of the party is.
Right.
And how much that will cost them in the primaries as the base, you know, airs out those issues.
Yeah.
The other interesting thing about where the Democratic primary contest is heading is that there's a clear undercurrent of resentment that there's too much attention right now on, you know, Biden, Beto, Bernie, you know, even Buttigieg, I suppose, but on the Bs, who are all men, and not enough on the women. Now, I think a lot of that has to do with kind of just the accidents of timing of who gets in when and who gets their attention, and then we move on to the next one. So, but once the field is all together, the question will be how much the female candidates are going to be able to get the kind of coverage that some of the men get, particularly if they're not polling as well. I mean, if you have Biden and Sanders, you know, combined over 50% and everybody else in, you know, 10, 8, 6 for a while, how is that going to play out in terms of the attention that everybody gets?
And how do you think that would play out with the base if it were 2 white men, Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders, battling it out for the nomination? Do you think that would have a depressive effect, or would Democrats kind of get over that and rally around their candidates?
I mean, if you look at polls, people say, women in particular, say that they want somebody that can defeat Donald Trump, and polls indicate that there's skepticism that a woman could do that. I don't know that there's any evidence to suggest that a female candidate wouldn't do as well as a male candidate, but if the perception out there is that it's possible that this could be a problem, I don't think you'd necessarily wind up with a lot of backlash.
No, and obviously if either's the nominee, they would pick a female as their vice presidential candidate. So it's, I think the desire to beat Trump literally trumps everything else.
And the other is we have so many months to run to look at these candidates. I mean, we're in the very easy stage of this. People are all running their own campaigns. There's not a lot of externalities that are affecting their campaigns. They're not being buffeted. They're not they're not going negative on one another. That will eventually change, and you'll get a much better sense of, you know, who has what it really takes to go the distance.
But can I ask, I'm just curious, can I ask the panel, if you ask me at this perspective, who is the best run presidential candidate so far? It's Kamala Harris. She's had a great rollout. She's not made mistakes. It's an incredibly disciplined run. And you could sort of see this carrying on.
Well, I mean, I take that point, but I would also say that she's had moments where she's shown that she's not quite as ready as she probably ought to be, and isn't going to have the luxury of not being in the spotlight for a lot of this. I mean, the ease with which she answered the question in the CNN town hall meeting about getting rid of private insurance, in which she just said, yeah, let's get rid of it, and has kind of struggled to how kind of put that back in the bottle since then, said, not just to me, but a number of Democrats who've been through presidential campaigns, a candidate has to be better in those moments. Now, having said that, Barack Obama was not a particularly good candidate in the first stages of his candidacy. There was a healthcare forum literally at this moment in 2007 out in Las Vegas, and he was on the stage, and Clinton was on the stage, and John Edwards was on the stage, and of those three, he was by far the worst in the way he handled that moment, and that he did not have anything substantive to say. He got asked some very tough questions and didn't respond very well, and realized that he was not as good a candidate as he needed to be. The challenge for all of these folks this time is that they're even more in the spotlight than they were before, so those little things can make a difference.
So one of the names that came up earlier, and here I'm just really curious if anyone has insights into this, Pete Buttigieg. What's behind the Pete Buttigieg boomlet? Why is he sort of capturing everyone's attention once they learn how to pronounce his last name?
All right, so
this is my response.
So I know Mayor Pete a little bit, and the way you say it, it's boot edge edge, boot edge edge, and just say it fast, Buttigieg. He's got a great profile, Harvard Rhodes Scholar, veteran, gay, mayor. He will proudly say he's got more executive branch experience than either the president or the vice president. But what you see is authenticity. He gets asked a question and he answers it, and he answers it directly. He doesn't hem and haw. He gives it sometimes unpopular answers to questions, but it's authenticity. Now, can he go the distance? I have no idea. It'd be interesting to poll women candidates versus a gay candidate, or what Americans think of that. But what it's shown again is that there's this hunger for something different, for authenticity, even if it's not necessarily popular.
I think the way he has performed when he's been on a stage has impressed people. He's clearly benefiting from a candidate who came in with very low expectations. I mean, not only did nobody know him or be able to pronounce his name, he's 37 years old. I mean, this is not the normal profile of somebody who eventually becomes president, but we've seen in recent campaigns that we may have a totally different definition of what it is to be a president, and so people are more open to that. So people are looking at him and wondering who he is, and in watching him, he's performed exceedingly well. There's a lot of difference between doing a good CNN town hall or being, fawned over by Joe and Mika on Morning Joe and running an effective campaign. But you have to say at this stage, he's taken advantage of every opportunity and he's kind of maximized it. So he deserves some of the credit he's getting for running an effective campaign.
I also think there's something to be said about buying into, okay, people don't know how to pronounce his name, he's going to make that a campaign shtick. Now we all know how to pronounce his name. Guess what one of the best indicators of how well you poll is? Your name recognition, right? So I mean, at this stage of the game, he's also demonstrated an ability to strategize in a way that maybe we wouldn't expect from a small town mayor. I mean, the last time we had a small town mayor this serious running for president, her name was thinking about running for president, it was Sarah Palin after she had been the vice presidential nominee. So it's not unheard of that, sort of people come out of the groundwork. And she had been governor of Alaska, which probably has the same population as South Bend. So, but I do think that I think there is a strategy there coupled with the authenticity that when you've got a really, really crowded field, allows you to break away, in a way that some of these other candidates can't.
All right, I'm going to ask one more question, and then we're going to open it up to the audience. So get your questions ready. Social media. Donald Trump is known for his use of Twitter. Does it matter how these upcoming Democratic candidates use social media? Is anything of importance happening on Twitter for the Democrats? And B, who's got the best Twitter game?
The best Twitter game I've seen is Pete Buttigieg's husband.
Yeah.
If you are not following Chasten Buttigieg, you should do it. He's very, very funny, and he's irreverent, and so. But the serious answer is yes. Social media makes a huge difference today. I mean, the rules are so different than they were, when Obama ran. I mean, just in that amount of time, and Obama was effective at using social media, but Twitter was barely something in 2008, and now it can have a big difference, and Trump has proven that.
I think it's just one more tool in the arsenal where candidates have to be able to effectively deploy it. So the same way that they do a debate and they have to do okay, or at least exceed expectations, the same way that their campaign ads have to make a key set of statements and let voters know what they stand for, the same way that press conferences matter, or speaking to reporters off the cuff matters, what you communicate via social media matters. And it matters not only to journalists and loyal followers, but it also matters in terms of what gets retweeted and what other people find out hearing about it. I mean, I'm a complete CNN junkie. It's unfortunate, it's sad. I spend all of my time watching CNN, like seriously. And, and I can't tell you how often it says like breaking news, Trump tweets about X, right? And so like that's actually become the main news, and it's become, it's how the candidates themselves set the agenda. So I don't think we can overlook it.
But one thing about Twitter is it is not at all representative of the public at large.
Right.
I mean,
Right.
that
When
we
you
have
look at
to.
the number of people on Twitter versus Facebook versus Instagram,
Right.
it's significantly lower.
Yeah.
Right,
I mean,
but for
it-
journalists and newsmaking,
It drives conversation, but it does. To what extent does it actually penetrate
Right.
population at large? I mean, it's not that it's unimportant, but it's certainly not the only game.
I would say on social media, Beto O'Rourke, hands down, is killing it. We probably have learned a little too much about his life, and there's a little too much, you know, and we could have a conversation about whether a woman could basically, you know, live cast, you know, going to the dentist or whatever he did, or his road trips. But he does it, and it's effective, and it's authentic. And that's what, if your Twitter feed looks like glorified press releases, it's not effective. It has to be authentic, and he's made it authentic.
except is it really authentic if you plan to sit in the dentist chair, open your mouth, and stick your phone in it? Like, I mean, I just think, like, we say, oh, this candidate's
Jen,
so
we're
authentic.
talking about it. That's the thing. We are talking about it. That's
No,
the
we
thing.
are.
But
So,
not
no,
in a
it's
positive
strategic.
way.
It's strategic. I mean, I guess my feeling is at this point, I'm a little cynical. I feel like they strategize about how to seem authentic, and that's a way that you can do it.
I think the other aspect of social media is the degree to which the Trump campaign used it very effectively. Not Twitter, but aspects of Facebook in ways of communicating to voters that nobody else could see. And they have a huge digital operation. They had big digital operation. It'll be bigger this time around. I mean, I don't think you can underestimate the power of that in reaching voters in ways that, you know, we're all still trying to figure out.
Excellent. Well, we're going to open it up to questions. If you could raise your hand, and then I'll call on you, and if you'll wait for the microphone, that would be great.
Hi. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you very much. You discussed the future of the Democratic Party, mostly in terms of domestic issues. How about foreign policy and foreign relations?
You want me to take that? You know, Vice President Biden will use foreign policy as a strong calling card. It will be very much a combination of the Obama foreign policy and things that he has advocated over the years. It will be in contrast to President Trump's foreign policy, and that contrast will be pretty stark and pretty significant. He was at the Munich Security Conference a month ago and got a strong response from a European audience for basically saying, we're not like what you may think Donald Trump is like, and we'll be back at some point. But I think there are other questions that the Democratic field will begin to have to answer, which is what is the foreign policy of the Democratic Party at this point, particularly on the use of military and the role of military intervention, and what do you do about Afghanistan, and what do you do about Syria? What happened in Syria was not a particularly strong moment for the Obama administration, and the legacy of some of those calls is going to be difficult. The other question is how do the Democrats approach the question of China? I mean, the broad foreign policy consensus about China, which lasted for many years, which was the more they become part of the global economic system, the more they will become a more democratic society, and clearly that link has been broken under Xi Jinping, and so as a result of that, whether it's Republicans or Democrats, have to rethink what is the right posture in the approach to China. So there are a lot of questions like that that will not get addressed front and center, because foreign policy often isn't front and center, particularly in a Democratic primary. But there are some tough questions that Democrats will have to answer.
You know, I'd say, and I'm glad Dan mentioned the Munich Security Conference, and if you haven't seen it, go back and watch Vice President Biden's remarks. He talks about standing up for democracies, opposing totalitarianism, standing up for the free press, alliances. Those remarks could have been given by John McCain, Mitt Romney, virtually any Republican president. It could be given by the majority of the U.S. Senate, Democrat and Republican. And while I don't think foreign policy typically plays a role in presidential primaries in particular, I think it's an unknown, and I think that is sort of the distinction that Biden has over anyone else in the field right now. That I think if he wants to make that, and I think there's a sense that, you know, maybe he's a little too old, maybe he's a little too centrist, moderate, but a return to sort of normalcy, that could have actually a very powerful appeal. The other thing I would add is where Democrats stand on trade right now. If you go back and think about where NAFTA getting through, because Bill Clinton pushed it through, trade agreements generally have to come up with some weird alliance of shrinking pro-trade Republicans and Democrats. And you see, I think, the challenges that the president will have in getting this new Canada-Mexico agreement done. Both those extremes that have typically supported free trade are getting smaller and smaller right now.
Yeah, I think that might be one of the more interesting places where there will be some real differences between, say, Bernie Sanders and some of the other candidates.
So I've read recently some more traditional Democrats bringing up the specter of McGovern 72. In light of how far some of these candidates are out there with very liberal, very progressive, whether it's abortion or health care or open borders or guaranteed income. And they're arguing that if you nominate somebody to the extreme, you're going to have a phenomenon that you've moved too far from the country, and Nixon, Trump, can beat this liberal candidate. I was wondering how concerned you are about that potential phenomenon.
I'm not concerned. I'm not concerned for a couple of reasons. The first is that we know what happened in '72, and the candidates understand what the electoral map looks like. They also understand what percentage of the vote they need in various states. And we're much better now at micro-targeting and figuring out what our win numbers are in various places. The second thing is the distance among the candidates, the distance among the Democrats, while small, among each other, is very, very different than Donald Trump. And the Democrats, as we mentioned earlier, are actually on the side of public opinion, so especially among their base. So there's nothing among Democrats in the population that would suggest they would be turned off by even the most liberal of these candidates. And it's unclear that conservative voters would find any of these candidates appealing enough to vote for anyway. So I think as the parties have polarized, the kind of threat that we saw earlier 20, 30, 40 years ago is less important right now.
Can I make a couple of points? One is we're not going to see the kind of landslide today that we saw in '72 or '64. The country's too closely divided for that to happen. But I think that what we've already seen from President Trump is, and he will make every effort to cherry pick, if you will, aspects of what this Democrat or that Democrat or that Democrat are saying and bundle them up in a way that he will try to minimize the support that the Democratic nominee has in places like suburban areas. If you look at his State of the Union address, that was a kind of an indicator of what they are thinking about. I mean, one was that very strong message about we're not going to be a socialist country. Democrats are going to run away most of the Democrats are going to run away from the socialist tag. Bernie Sanders will not. He's a democratic socialist. But most will run away from that, and yet Trump will try to drive that point. The second is he will try to, in one way or another, soften his own image and soften the image of what the Republican Party is about. He did some things in that State of the Union address that seemed clearly designed to do that. And if you know, in '04, when Bush was in many ways an underdog for re-election, the Rove strategy was to pick off a couple of percentage points of this Democratic group or a couple of percentage points of that Democratic group in order to get Bush up to the necessary number that he needed to do. That may be part of what Trump has to do. Now, Trump's a totally different kind of an animal, and he'll run a much more bombastic kind of campaign, and he will do whatever it takes. But that combination could put a Democratic nominee in jeopardy if they are not, if they're not smart and shrewd about how they combat it.
Donald Trump has consumed the oxygen out of every political environment that we've had since he's been around. And it seems to me that the Democratic Party has been unable to push through that in messaging. Everything from that horrendous tax bill that has affected people all over the country in the worst possible ways in some cases, people who vote for Donald Trump. Why is that the case? Am I too much in the angry base well here? It does seem like there's a real blockade there in information.
I mean, look, I don't disagree with you, and I think part of it is the tenor the tenor of Trump gets louder and louder. It's louder and louder on both sides. But again, I mean, it's the challenge of when you are, at least for the first 2 years, in the minority party, you don't have an effective spokesperson for you. If you go back and look, it's probably no different than when Barack Obama was president, at least for folks on the right, for George W. Bush. I mean, people wanted to impeach George W. Bush after the Iraq War, and all we were doing is talking about Iraq. So it's louder because everything is louder now. But I'm not sure it's differences of degree. People of one side are always opposed to the president of the other side. You all may disagree.
Well, I guess I would say that I do think Trump has a particular genius, if you will, for being able to dominate a conversation and to create a conversation and to create diversion from a conversation if that conversation's not helpful to him, even if the next conversation he creates is not particularly helpful to him either. I mean, he just keeps us moving in one direction or another. And to some extent, I mean, the media is susceptible to that. I recognize that, and I think that that's a fair criticism. But I also think that he is somebody who is a celebrity, who is a reality, who thinks in the way a reality TV star thinks. He doesn't necessarily think like a traditional president thinks. He thinks about dominating every moment of every day of every conversation, of winning that, of creating the best show he possibly can. I mean, I've heard people say that that when he is giving a big speech, the first question he asks is, when he's looking at the text that he's given, what's the headline? He wants to know those kinds of things. And so he's very skillful at that. And the challenge for any of the people who have tried to go after him, whether it's his Republican opponents in 2016 or Hillary Clinton or Democrats in 2020, is there an effective way to counter that? Can you drown that out? Should you try to drown that out? Is there an alternative way you can speak about it? The one thing we know about Trump is that almost, without exception, everybody who has tried has been diminished in going after him. Whether it's, people in the Republican Party, people in the Democratic Party. So I think that's the challenge for Democrats. It is a frustration to a lot of Democratic activists, but nobody's quite found the formula for an alternative way to take him on.
I think also he's demonstrated a willingness to be dismissive in a way that we would have assumed politicians would not want to be. So when he's asked a question that he doesn't like, or when he's presented with a fact that he doesn't like, he says fake news. And once you say fake news, there's no discussion anymore. So he's not engaging, he's willing to not engage in the debate and the deliberation that other heads of state have generally felt was their responsibility. And as a result of that, he wins a lot of these conversations because he stops them and he just ends them. And I think that becomes the challenge. It's not a recipe that normatively you want to suggest that the Democrats adopt, because debate and deliberation and discussion is generally an attractive thing in a democratic society. But a way to really, sort of continue to dominate is just say no. I mean, we even think back to the 2016 debates, right? In addition to demeaning the candidates on the primary stage, when people would say things, he would literally chime into the microphone, low energy, loser, right? Like, I mean, just so it's just him demonstrating that he's not even willing to have this conversation. He doesn't want to have the discussion.
And yet I would argue this. If the president simply stopped tweeting and kept his rhetoric within a certain norm that we sort of expect from our presidents, and simply rode the back of this economy, his approval ratings would be significantly higher than they are now. So I agree that he is trying to dominate the airwaves. The question is whether that's effective for him in a positive way or not.
It's a very interesting conversation, but thinking about what you've been saying, I've been struck with two comments, and I'll be interested in your response. The first one is you brought up social media as the new and important thing. And it has a role, but I'm struck with orators and being able to deliver in any popular form, even because it doesn't have to be a big place. I mean, President Trump gets good coverage when he speaks to these rehearsed special groups, and he's a very good orator. He just is. I mean, Obama was, and he did it on one speech. And people are talking about Stacey Abrams, one speech. So my question to you is, do you think the right strategy for the Democrats in selecting it is, let me get the other point, and then I'll get to that, because it's the same thing. It's just an embellishment. Your second comment, he's a great showman. And he is. He's a wonderful showman. So if you take those two together, one, to be a good showman, and two, to really be good in making yourself look presidential, get your views across, and look like Obama looked, like a very good person. That's the comparison to the president. That's the most striking. Whatever else you think. People don't have any regard. Even real supporters say, I like what he does, and let's disregard the other things. But the real contrast is that. So my question then is, shouldn't we use those criteria in picking who should be the candidate? Good showman, good speaker, look the moral role.
I mean, I don't want to end up with our version of Donald Trump, right? I mean, maybe it's naive. Like, I would love it if the nominee had those qualifications, but I would also like the person to be well-grounded in policy and able to conduct international relations and somebody with a sense of compassion. Like, I think that when you think about underlying values, those still matter a lot. And so, sure, all else equal, definitely. But I think a lot of the time, all else is not equal.
Look, I would love to say that somebody's oratorical skills matter now. Again, I think in an age of social media, cable news, all these things, our attention spans have just gotten like this now. It's funny that Dan mentioned the State of the Union address. I was like, God, how long ago was that? That was like 2 months ago. Or it was like a month and a half ago. And it's like we've moved on to something else. And so it's an unfortunate thing, because I think we can think of, remember memorable speeches that presidents have given throughout history. And I think those, in some ways, it's harder to make this impact in a world where our attention spans are so short right now.
But I think your point is an important one, because I do think we are in a time, and have been for a while, where celebrity has an impact. And where the ability to, through oratory or even in small settings, to kind of raise the sights of people and to energize and excite them still matters. Chris, you're absolutely right. I mean, these moments, fade quickly, but there are certain things that people take away, and there's also sadly or not, there's an entertainment quality to politics, and you have to be, in part, I mean, not a comedian in that sense, but you have to provide people with something that they want to come and see and get excited about. And so, what's that you know, what's that formula? I don't know what it is, and that's part of the thing that Democratic voters will be looking at in all of these candidates. I mean, one of the things we've seen so far this year is that Democratic activists, at least at this point, are hungry to examine the field of candidates. They're not, you know, as I've said before, there are a lot more shoppers than buyers at this point. They're lookers rather than buyers. But they are looking, and they want to hear and see from everybody, and they're kind of evaluating, and they're not ready to make up their mind, but they're going to factor all of this in, and some of those qualities are going to be very important.
All right, well, we are still about 20 months away from the presidential election, so there will be plenty of time to continue this conversation, and hopefully we can continue it even after the cameras are shut off. But we're going to end it there. Please help me thank our wonderful panelists.